I'm sure you won't believe me if I tell you that there is such a thing as a money tree. I mean, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I too wouldn't have believed it. Mora Williamson was a great pie maker. She loved baking, and her favourites were gooseberry, raspberry or blackberry. But most of all, she enjoyed apple pies. And she would bake these pies at home in her kitchen, and she would sell them at all sorts of events in her locality. Jumble sales, the local WI. She would do it for little old ladies in their homes, all and sundry, wherever she could. And the money that she made from these sales of the pies would go to charity. She was very much a good doer, really, one of those people who get involved in the community and help, providing meals for the infirm and helping anybody to get to the post office, to do their shopping, all that sort of stuff. But the one thing that she loved was to be by her range baking these pies. And as I say, the apple pies were her favourite, and mainly because she had a number of apple trees, 5 in fact, that would provide a reasonable crop of cooking apples. One night there was a rather dramatic thunderstorm and lightning everywhere, which was unusual for the time of year. But it soon went away and she went back to her pie making. Well, one time when she was delivering her pies at a little community hall, a woman came up to her and said, "Oh, excuse me, Moira, I don't want to sound funny, but when I was eating one of your delicious pies, and they are very nice, I happened to find this at the bottom." And she held up a coin. It was a shilling. Moira looked at this shilling and said, "Goodness gracious, I'm really, really sorry. It was in one of my pies, was it? I've no idea how it got into the pie. I do apologise." And the lady said, "Well, I thought you'd better have it back because you probably would miss it." She said, "Oh, no, that's my fault. I shouldn't have let it get into the pies. I hope you're not dissatisfied. Keep the shilling. Have it." And as she was talking, another woman approached from the village hall and said, "Oh, I couldn't help overhearing, Moira, but it's very strange, and what a coincidence, really, because we enjoyed, my husband and I, one of your delicious pies, and we also found a shilling at the bottom of the pie." "Goodness," said Moira, wondering what had happened here. "How can it be?" She said, "Oh, I am very sorry." Anyway, she went home, and she was going to do some more cooking. She liked eating some of the pies herself. Indeed, she was a good pie eater. And as she sat down that evening, she thought, well, I'll have one of these pies. She opened it up, and sure enough, in the bottom was 5 shillings. The weird part was that Moira didn't really have all that much money, and to have 3 shillings lying about, not least in the kitchen area, and to fall into the pie mix was a little odd. So she put these shillings, or at least the shilling she retained, on the side and thought, this is very strange. Well, the following week it was baking day. She went into the garden and she collected up some of the apples that had fallen and a few that hadn't. And she went into her kitchen, she made up the pastry and got it all ready, laid it all out, and she was about to cut up the apples to stew them ready to go into the pies. And as she cut the first apple, she hit something solid, something metal. Well, blow me, she thought, as she picked up this object, and sure enough, it was a shilling. That is extraordinary, she thought. How did the shilling get into the apple? That is the most craziest thing. Anyway, she chopped up that apple and put it into the mix, and she had 2 more to go, and she chopped to the next one, and 2 shillings tumbled out, separated in the middle, 2 shillings, complete with the Queen's face on it and everything. My goodness, she thought. This is most peculiar. She grabbed hold of the 3rd apple and sliced that open, and a further shilling fell out. She looked at them and she put them on a shelf, And she rushed out into the garden and she looked at the tree. She noticed that many of the apples actually were far bigger than normal. In fact, ever since the thunderstorm, the apples seemed to have grown, swelled. She picked the biggest one she could find and brought it down into her kitchen, and with a big knife she sliced it open, and 5 shillings came out. 5. She put the shillings on the shelf. She continued to make her pies and she sold them as normal, and then she came back home and she decided, I'll see how many more apples have got shillings in them. And so she went and picked 10, 20, maybe even 30, and she sliced them open, and each one either had 1, 2, 3, 4 or even 5 shillings contained within them. And she stacked them up on the shelf and she looked at that money and she thought, my goodness. As she looked out of the window, she realised that she actually had a money tree, that money grew on trees. This was incredible. She started to collect more apples and slice them open and stack up the money that she found in them. But she sort of wasn't making pies anymore. The novelty of the pie making seemed to have disappeared from her, and she was more interested in slicing open the apples to see how much money was contained in and stacking them up on her shelf. The rest of the fruit she just threw away. And as she kept doing this, and the money kept stacking up. And as the money kept stacking up, she thought to herself, do you know what? My cooking utensils, they're all a bit grotty, aren't they? They're all a bit old and battered and no good. I think I might buy some more. So she took some of the money, some of the shillings, and she went down to the cooking shop and she bought a whole load of more. A nice whisk and a big bowl and a rolling pin and various things, and maybe a bit of cutlery while she was there. She had still quite a few shillings left over, and so as she passed the hat shop, she thought, maybe a new hat would be quite nice, and possibly a blouse. And soon this became a bit of a ritual. She would go into the garden, she would pick up the fallen apples, and she would pick more of them, she would open them up, she would get the money, and she would toddle off into town and have a look and spend a few pennies, or a few shillings. There was a new rug that would look nice in the front room, that would look very nice, and curtains, and maybe she could replace some of the furniture, perhaps a new bureau, and a tall boy for the bedroom, and a whole load of stuff. And as she fervently kept spending the money, she would find a lot more in the apple trees. And weirdly, even though the season was now passing, the tree continued to produce big, succulent apples. And hacking at these apples, she would pull out the 4 or 5 shillings and she would save them up on her shelf and then go out and buy something new. More clothes, more furniture, more exciting things. And as one day she was sitting there with all this stuff cluttered about her house, and she realised, actually, do you know what? This little grotty little house is too small, far too small for her and all her things. No, this would never do. And she'd noticed that the big house on the hill above the village, the house that looked down on everybody else, had become up for sale. Ooh, she thought. And she had a look at how much money she had and how much money was on the trees. And it was a very expensive house, and she didn't really have enough to buy the house complete. But she could get a mortgage. She could make a down payment. So she went to the mortgage broker and spoke to the owner of the house and said, look, I would be very interested in doing that. I want to sell my grotty little house and buy that big house. And here's the money I've accrued, and what will happen? And the mortgage person advisor said, yes, there's no problem at all. We'll sort you out a mortgage. And he sorted out a mortgage with repayments every month. And she was very happy. Oh, yes. Now, she was canny, you see, because she realised if she sold the old house and the garden, of course, her trees, her source of income, would disappear. But apples have seeds, don't they? And seeds grow into trees, don't they? And there are a lot of seeds in all the apples that she'd got, and she could plant them. and the garden of the big house was huge. She could plant a veritable forest if she so wished, and be rich beyond her wildest dreams. So she gathered up as many apples as she could. She took as much money out of the apples as she could, but more important now were the seeds. She collected loads of them in a big bag, and she decided, that's it, I will sell the house. But before she did sell the house, and before she moved into the new house, she felt, I don't want my secret getting out. I don't want others being able to earn money from the tree. Goodness gracious, no, that would be no good. So she arranged for a woodman to come, and he obliged. Strange that this lovely old lady would want all these trees chopped down, all 5 of them producing what looked like amazing fruit, but she was insistent, I'll pay you well, I'll pay you more than you normally get paid, and she shoved the coins into his hand, and obligingly he chopped all the trees down, and she says, I don't want the wood, give it to a good cause or anything, or take it for yourself, I don't care, just burn it. So he did, and there were no more apple trees in the garden. But she had a bag of seeds, and she moved into the new house, and all the furniture traipsed in there, and she had her mortgage, and she planted these seeds all in the garden. Hundreds of them. She knew, of course, it would take a little bit of time for the apple trees to grow and produce fruit, but not that long, really. And she'd kept a load of the apples, and she stored them in an outside shed, where she nurtured them and kept them with newspapers and all of that. And she could be a little bit frugal for a short while, living up there in her big house, or so she thought. She thought she could be frugal. But every time she went into town in her posh clothes, she saw another dress and another hat and another piece of furniture that looked so much better than the other older furniture which she'd had only for about 6 months, and she would buy it. And soon the collection of apples that she was storing and the money contained within was dwindling until there was none left. And she still had mortgage payments to make. And she realised now she was in a bit of a tight spot. So it became necessary, in order to keep the lifestyle that she had and her standing in the local community, no more helping out with little old ladies going to the post office and things like that, that she might just have to sell a few of her precious things, a few of her gems and jewellery, and maybe the odd bit of furniture and that lovely pottery that was worth a hell of a lot of money. And so she did. But the mortgage payments kept coming, and these seedlings in the ground were taking so long to grow, and she looked after them obviously as best as she could. She was watering them and putting fertilizer down and really caring for them, and slowly they were growing, but they seemed weak and a bit feeble. Maybe it was the soil that wasn't quite right. There was something, and she kept on and on trying to persuade all of these seeds to grow. But the money was getting fewer and fewer, and the debts were getting higher and higher, and she was desperate. And then one day, when she was out in the garden, there was an apple on one of the saplings. An apple. It wasn't a particularly big apple, but it was an apple nonetheless. In fact, as she looked around the hundreds of little seedlings that were growing and the saplings, she saw there was another one. There were 3. She grabbed all of them, pulled them off the tree, took them into her kitchen, grabbed one of those very expensive knives that she had got, and hacked open the apple and opened it. But there was nothing in. There was nothing in it. No shilling, not even a 6pence. Not even a 3pence. Nothing. She hacked the others, the same. There was no money. She realised in that instant that she had made a terrible mistake. None of these saplings, none of these trees were going to produce money. And she still had the mortgage to pay, and she couldn't pay it. Suddenly she realised what she had done. And as she was moping in this situation and wondering what the hell she would do, she heard that the little cottage that she had left was up for sale once more. She realised that if she sold the house, the big house on the hill, she could pay off that mortgage and still have enough to buy back her original cottage, which she did. And she'd learnt her lesson. She had learnt her lesson that greed wasn't everything. She grew her gooseberries and she grew her raspberries and she grew her blackberries. And in the afternoons and evenings by the range, she would bake her cakes. And she got back involved in the community, helping little old ladies across the road and selling her pies and giving the money to charity. And all was well. All of that greed, all of that thought for the big house and the big coats and hats and furniture, long gone. And she felt very, very content. And one day she was sitting in her garden looking at some of the weeds that were coming up, and got down on her bended knees and started to pull them up, feeling how happy she was and how contented she was and how that part of her life was over. And as she was pulling the weeds out, she saw a green shoot. It was an apple tree. It was a green shoot of a small apple tree in her garden, in her original garden. And she looked at that apple tree with wide eyes.